September 7, 1940, and Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring stood on the French coast watching wave after wave of German bombers cross the Channel toward London. 348 bombers escorted by 617 fighters, the largest aerial armada ever assembled. Göring turned to his staff officers, his chest heavy with medals, his face flushed with certainty. "London will burn," he said. "In a week, Churchill will beg for terms. The British have no idea what is coming." He believed every word. Hitler believed it too. For months, the Luftwaffe had been trying to destroy the Royal Air Force to clear the skies for Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. But RAF Fighter Command refused to die. British pilots kept rising to meet each attack. Their numbers somehow never quite depleted, their resistance never quite broken, so the strategy shifted. If the RAF wouldn't fall, perhaps the British people would break their will, shatter their cities, make the cost of resistance unbearable, force Churchill's government to collapse under the weight of public despair. Göring had promised Hitler this would work. He'd staked his reputation on it. The Reichsmarshal, the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, the man who built the Luftwaffe from nothing, guaranteed that strategic bombing would bring Britain to its knees. "Give me 4 days of clear weather," he told Hitler, "and the RAF will be finished. Give me 4 weeks of bombing London and Britain will surrender." That first night, 300 tons of high explosive and thousands of incendiary bombs fell on London's East End. The docks burned. Warehouses exploded. Residential streets disappeared into rubble and flame. 30 civilians died. 600 were seriously injured. The temps reflected an orange glow visible for miles. German bomber crews flying home across the Channel could still see the fires burning behind them. In Berlin, the reports were triumphant. Massive destruction, overwhelming force, the beginning of the end. Hitler was pleased. Göring was vindicated. The invasion barges were already assembled in French ports, waiting for the moment when British resistance would crumble and the Wehrmacht could cross the Channel unopposed. But that moment never came. The second night, the bombers returned. The third night, the fourth. Every night for 57 consecutive nights, German aircraft pounded London. Civilians died by the hundreds, then by the thousands. Entire neighborhoods ceased to exist. Families huddled in underground stations using subway platforms as bomb shelters, sleeping on the tracks, emerging each morning to find their streets transformed into landscapes of broken brick and twisted metal. And yet they went to work. They cleared the rubble. They put out the fires. They rebuilt what could be rebuilt and worked around what couldn't. British aircraft production, which the bombing was supposed to actually increased. Factories dispersed, improvised, adapted. The RAF kept flying. Churchill's government never wavered. The British people, instead of breaking, seemed to harden. By mid-October, 6 weeks into the Blitz, the first cracks appeared in German confidence. Not publicly, not in the propaganda, but in the private conversations, in the diaries, in the tense meetings at the Reich Chancellery, doubt began to creep in. Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, wrote in his diary with growing skepticism. Halder was a professional soldier, a man who dealt in facts and logistics, not propaganda and wishful thinking. He watched the Blitz reports with a cold eye. British morale shows no sign of collapse, he noted. Industrial production continues. RAF remains operational. No indication that terror bombing is achieving strategic objectives. He was careful in his phrasing. You didn't directly contradict Hitler's strategy. You didn't suggest that Göring's promises were empty. But Halder's diary entries grew more pointed as autumn progressed. Luftwaffe loss is unsustainable, he wrote. No clear path to victory visible. British resistance stiffening rather than weakening. The numbers told a story that couldn't be ignored. German bomber losses were running at approximately 4 to 5% per raid. That might not sound catastrophic, but it was a steady hemorrhage. In a war of attrition, those losses added up. Crews were exhausted. Aircraft needed constant maintenance. The Luftwaffe was burning through resources at a rate that couldn't be sustained indefinitely. And for what? The British weren't surrendering. They weren't even negotiating. Churchill's speeches broadcast across the world were defiant. "We shall never surrender," he'd said in June. By October, with London burning night after night, he hadn't changed his tune. If anything, he'd grown more resolute. German intelligence reports landing on desks in Berlin painted an increasingly uncomfortable picture. British civilian morale was not collapsing. Yes, people were terrified. Yes, they were exhausted. Yes, thousands were dying, but the social order wasn't breaking down. There were no mass demonstrations demanding peace, no riots, no revolution. The British government remained firmly in control. War production continued. The RAF kept fighting. Göring received these reports with growing irritation. He'd promised Hitler a quick victory. He'd guaranteed that the Luftwaffe could deliver what the Wehrmacht couldn't achieve through invasion. And now, with each passing week, that promise looked more hollow. In late October, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The official reason was weather. The Channel crossing would be too dangerous as autumn storms arrived. But everyone in the German High Command understood the real reason. You couldn't invade Britain without air superiority. The Luftwaffe hadn't achieved air superiority. The RAF was still flying, still fighting, still making any attempted invasion suicidally dangerous for the slow-moving barges that would carry German troops across the Channel. The invasion was supposed to happen in September, then early October. Now it was postponed indefinitely, which was a polite way of saying cancelled. The window had closed. The Blitz had failed in its primary objective, but the bombing continued because what else could Germany do? They'd committed to this strategy. They'd told the German people that Britain would fall. They couldn't simply stop and admit failure. So the bombers kept flying night after night, and German leaders kept insisting that victory was just around the corner, that one more week of bombing would do it, that British resolve would crack any day now. Göring grew increasingly defensive. When subordinates brought him reports of continued British resistance, he blamed the intelligence services. When bomber crews reported heavy losses, he blamed their tactics. When the RAF kept intercepting German formations, he blamed his fighter commanders for not providing adequate escort. The Reichsmarschall, who'd been so confident in September, was now a man looking for someone else to blame. In November, Hitler's attention began to shift eastward. Operation Barbarossa, the planned invasion of the Soviet Union, started consuming more of his time. Staff meetings that had once focused on Britain now focused on Russia. The Führer was already thinking about the next campaign, the next promise of quick victory, the next guarantee that German military might would overwhelm any opponent. Alfred Jodl, chief of operations at the OKW, watched this shift with professional detachment. Jodl was a careful man, a planner who understood that wars were won through logistics and strategy, not through willpower and propaganda. He'd never fully believed that bombing alone would break Britain. Now, as Hitler's focus moved to the Soviet Union, Jodl understood what that meant. The British campaign had failed. Germany was moving on, but no one would say it out loud. No one would admit that the Blitz had been a strategic failure. Instead, the narrative shifted. The bombing of London wasn't about forcing surrender anymore. Now it was about tying down British resources, about preventing Britain from interfering with German operations elsewhere, about maintaining pressure while Germany dealt with other threats. The goalpost had moved, and in moving it, the German High Command tacitly admitted that the original goal, breaking Britain through terror bombing, had proven impossible. By December 1940, the Blitz had killed approximately 15,000 Londoners. Another 15,000 were seriously wounded. Over 1 million buildings were damaged or destroyed. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble. The docks, the railways, the warehouses, the factories all had taken enormous damage. And Britain was still fighting, still producing aircraft, still manning the defenses, still refusing to surrender. In the Reich Chancellery, the mood had shifted from confidence to frustration. Hitler, in meetings with his generals, no longer spoke of Britain's imminent collapse. Instead, he spoke of the Soviet Union, of Lebensraum, of crushing Bolshevism. Britain had become an afterthought, a problem to be dealt with later after the Soviet Union fell. This was the admission, though it was never stated explicitly. By turning his attention to Russia, while Britain remained undefeated, Hitler was acknowledging that the Blitz had failed. You don't leave a wounded enemy behind you unless you've given up on finishing them off quickly. Göring, meanwhile, grew increasingly erratic. The confident Reichsmarschall of September had become a defensive blame-shifting figure by winter. When Luftwaffe commanders reported that continued bombing of London was yielding diminishing returns, Göring ordered them to expand the target list. Birmingham, Coventry, Liverpool, Manchester, all would feel the weight of German bombs. If London wouldn't break, perhaps other cities would. Coventry was hit particularly hard on November 14, 1940. 568 people died in a single night. The medieval city center was destroyed. The cathedral, a landmark dating back centuries, was gutted by fire. German propaganda trumpeted this as a great victory. They even coined a new word, Coventrierin, to coventrate, meaning to utterly destroy through aerial bombing. But Coventry didn't surrender. Britain didn't surrender. The bombing continued, and so did British resistance. The gap between German expectations and reality grew wider with each passing week. In January 1941, Halder's diary entries became more pointed. British showing no sign of collapse, he wrote. Continued bombing appears to be hardening rather than weakening civilian resolve. Luftwaffe losses mounting. No strategic breakthrough visible. These were damning assessments from Germany's Chief of Army General Staff. Halder was essentially saying in carefully coded language that the entire strategic bombing campaign was failing, that Göring's promises had been empty, that Hitler's expectations had been unrealistic. But you couldn't say that directly. Not to Hitler, not in Nazi Germany, where admitting failure could be dangerous. So the bombing continued, even as the men planning it increasingly understood it wasn't working. Wilhelm Kittel, chief of the OKW, was in an impossible position. Kittel was a yes-man, a loyal subordinate who rarely contradicted Hitler. But even he could see that the British weren't breaking. In meetings, he began to carefully suggest that perhaps German resources might be better used elsewhere, that perhaps the Luftwaffe should focus on supporting the planned invasion of the Soviet Union, rather than continuing the fruitless bombing of British cities. Hitler listened, not because Kittel was persuasive, but because Hitler himself had already reached the same conclusion. Britain was proving more difficult than anticipated. Fine, Britain could wait. The Soviet Union, with its vast resources and territory, was the real prize. Break the Soviets and Britain would have no choice but to make peace. That was the new logic. It was a rationalization, a way to avoid admitting that the Blitz had failed. But it was also a strategic shift that tacitly acknowledged that failure. Germany was giving up on forcing Britain's surrender through bombing. The Blitz continued through the spring of 1941, but with decreasing intensity. Luftwaffe units were being withdrawn, redeployed to the east for the coming invasion of the Soviet Union. The massive raids of autumn 1940 became smaller, more sporadic attacks. London still burned, but not every night, not with the same overwhelming force. On May 10, 1941, the Luftwaffe launched its heaviest raid on London. 550 bombers dropped 700 tons of high explosive and thousands of incendiaries. 400 civilians died. 12,000 buildings were destroyed or damaged. The House of Commons was hit. The British Museum was damaged. It was the most destructive single raid of the entire Blitz, and it was the last major raid on London for 3 years. The next night the bombers didn't come, or the night after that. The Blitz, for all practical purposes, was over. The Luftwaffe was moving east. In Berlin, there was no announcement of failure, no admission that the strategy hadn't worked. The propaganda line was that Germany had achieved its objectives, that Britain had been sufficiently weakened, that German forces were now needed elsewhere for more important operations. But the men who planned the Blitz knew the truth. Göring knew. Hitler knew. Jodl knew. Halder knew. The Blitz had failed to break Britain. It had failed to destroy the RAF. It had failed to British industry. It had failed to force Churchill's government to negotiate. It had failed in every strategic objective it was meant to achieve. 20,000 Londoners had died. Over 1 million buildings had been damaged or destroyed. Countless families had been shattered, and Britain was still fighting. In private conversations, German leaders began to acknowledge this carefully and obliquely. Göring, speaking to subordinates, blamed British stubbornness as if this was somehow unexpected. "They're too stupid to know when they're beaten," he said, trying to frame British resilience as a character flaw rather than a failure of German strategy. Hitler, in a conversation with Jodl, was more philosophical. "The British are a Germanic people," he said. "They have a certain toughness, but once we've dealt with the Soviets, they'll see reason. They'll understand that continued resistance is pointless." This was Hitler's way of avoiding the admission. Britain hadn't been beaten because Britain couldn't be beaten through bombing alone. But Hitler couldn't say that. So instead he reframed it. Britain was tough, but they'd come around eventually. After Germany won in the East, Halder, the most honest of the German high command in his private writings, was blunter. "Strategic bombing campaign against Britain has failed to achieve objectives," he wrote in his diary. "British morale intact, industrial capacity unbroken, rough operational, No prospect of imminent British collapse. Resources would be better allocated to Eastern Campaign. This was as close as anyone in the German High Command came to openly stating the truth. The Blitz had failed. It had been a waste of resources, a squandering of Luftwaffe strength, a strategic dead end. Germany had thrown everything it could at London and other British cities, and Britain had absorbed the punishment and kept fighting. The question that haunted German planners, though few would voice it, was simple. If Germany couldn't break Britain through bombing, and couldn't invade Britain without air superiority and couldn't achieve air superiority because the RAF refused to be destroyed, then how exactly was Germany supposed to win the war in the West? There was no good answer, so Germany did what powers often do when faced with an insoluble problem. They changed the subject. They attacked the Soviet Union instead, opening a second front, pursuing a different victory, hoping that somehow eventually Britain would become irrelevant. But Britain didn't become irrelevant. Britain remained an unsinkable aircraft carrier off the coast of Europe, a base for American forces, a staging ground for the eventual invasion of occupied Europe. The failure to break Britain in 1940 and 41 proved to be one of the most consequential strategic failures of the entire war. After the war, in interrogations and memoirs, German leaders were more candid about what had happened. Göring, facing trial at Nuremberg, admitted that the Blitz had been a failure. "We never had enough bombers," he said, trying to blame logistics rather than strategy. "If we'd had twice as many aircraft, we could have done it." This was self-serving nonsense. Germany had thrown massive resources at Britain. The problem wasn't quantity. The problem was that strategic bombing, as practiced in World War II, couldn't break a determined, well-organized modern nation. The technology wasn't precise enough. The bombers weren't survivable enough. The psychological assumptions were wrong. But Göring couldn't admit that the entire strategy had been flawed from the start. That would mean admitting his own failure, his own incompetence, his own role in one of Germany's greatest strategic blunders. So he blamed resources. If only he'd had more bombers, more bombs, more time. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, was more honest in his post-war writings. The British bombing campaign proved that civilian morale could not be broken through terror. He wrote, "If anything, the bombing strengthened British resolve. We learned this lesson, but we learned it too late, and we never fully accepted it." Speer was right. The Blitz demonstrated something that would be proven again and again throughout the war. Bombing civilians doesn't break their will to fight. It hardens it. It transforms abstract political conflicts into personal vendettas. It gives people a reason to hate, a reason to endure, a reason to support their government's war effort, even when that effort demands terrible sacrifices. The Germans learned this lesson in London. The British would later apply it to German cities. The Americans would apply it to Japan. And in every case, the result was the same: massive destruction, enormous casualties, but no collapse of civilian morale, no surrender forced through terror. Hitler himself, in his final days in the Berlin bunker, never explicitly acknowledged that the Blitz had failed. He blamed Göring for incompetence. He blamed his generals for lack of will. He blamed the British for their stubborn refusal to recognize German superiority. But he never admitted that the strategy itself had been fundamentally flawed. This was typical of Hitler's thinking. Failure was always someone else's fault. If the Blitz hadn't broken Britain, it was because Göring hadn't executed it properly, or because the Luftwaffe hadn't had enough resources, or because the British were irrationally stubborn. Never. Because the entire concept of breaking a major industrial power through strategic bombing was based on false assumptions about human psychology and military capability. The truth, which became clear only in retrospect, was that the Blitz was doomed from the start. Not because of any specific tactical failure, not because of insufficient resources, but because the fundamental premise was wrong. You couldn't bomb Britain into submission. You couldn't destroy the RAF through attrition. You couldn't break British civilian morale through terror. Germany needed to either invade Britain successfully, which required air superiority they couldn't achieve, or they needed to accept that Britain would remain an enemy for the duration of the war. Instead, they tried to find a middle path, a way to force British surrender without invasion through bombing alone. And it didn't work. Month after month, the bombers flew, the bombs fell, the cities burned, and Britain kept fighting. Month after month, the bombers flew, the bombs fell, The cities burned and Britain kept fighting. The gap between German expectations and reality grew wider. The frustration in Berlin grew more intense, and eventually Germany gave up, though they never formally admitted it. The last major raid on London was in May 1941. By June, Germany was invading the Soviet Union. The Blitz was over not because it had succeeded, but because Germany had run out of patience and needed its aircraft elsewhere. In the end, what did German High Command say when the London Blitz failed to break Britain? They said very little, at least publicly. They changed the subject. They shifted resources. They pursued other objectives. They never formally acknowledged that the strategy had failed, because acknowledging failure wasn't how Nazi Germany operated. But in their private writings, in their diary entries, in their conversations with subordinates, the admission was there. Halder's skeptical notes, Jodel's strategic reorientations, Göring's defensive blame-shifting, Hitler's turn toward the Soviet Union. All of these were admissions, implicit but clear. The Blitz had failed. Britain would not be broken through bombing. The war would continue, and Germany would have to find another way to win it or accept that they couldn't win it at all. 20,000 dead Londoners, over 1 million damaged buildings, months of terror and destruction, and in the end Britain was still standing, still fighting, still defiant. The German High Command had promised that bombing would break British will. They'd staked their strategy on it. They'd committed enormous resources to it. And they'd been wrong. Catastrophically, consequentially wrong. The kind of wrong that changes the course of wars and the fate of nations. The kind of wrong that in 1940 and 41 helped ensure that Nazi Germany would eventually lose the war they'd started. But they never quite said it out loud. Not in those words. Not with that clarity. Because admitting you were wrong in Hitler's Germany was dangerous. So instead they moved on. They found new enemies. They made new promises. They pursued new strategies. And Britain, battered but unbroken, watch them, don't forget to subscribe.